Hever Castle is one of the most remarkable historic houses in Britain. It's got 700 years of turbulent history, marked by glitz and glamour, as well as decline and fall. Today I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour and show you my favourite bits. Let's go!
First off, here's a potted history of the place. At the start of the 13th century, this site was home to a timber Mott and Bailey castle. This would have been quite a basic structure, a timber hall with just a few outbuildings.
But in 1271, during the reign of King Edward I, the design was taken up a notch. Permission was granted to strengthen the house at Hever with a wall of stone and lime, and to crenellate it in the manner of a castle. So, a gatehouse was built to replace the original timber hall.
And it was from this gatehouse, which still stands today, that more additions were made in the 14th century. Soon there were crenellated walls with towers on the corners. They added a moat and even a great hall.
It's hard to imagine, but in the 14th century, the exterior walls would have been whitewashed with a mixture of powdered chalk and water, and even decorated in bright, bold colours. This wasn't just to make the castle more imposing, it was also to protect the stone. Across the years, all sorts of people have lived here at Hever Castle. Since the 13th century, it's passed through 37 different owners and 13 families. It was originally the home of William de Hever, who gave the castle its name. And in the 15th century, the Fiennes family lived here, the ancestors of the great explorer Sir Ranulph Fiennes.
Of course, the most famous of Hever's residents were the Boleyn family, who then spelt their name B-U-L-L-E-N. The castle was bought by Geoffrey Boleyn in 1462, and it was his grandson, Thomas Boleyn, who lived here and raised his 3 children, Mary, Anne and George. And it was Anne Boleyn, the middle child, who became Henry VIII's second wife.
Spoiler alert, the Boleyns' rise to power didn't last long. In fact, it was cut brutally short when Anne and George Boleyn were accused of adultery and incest and executed in 1536. Their father, Thomas Boleyn, was shunned at court and died 2 years later.
With the Boleyns out the picture, Hever Castle came into the possession of King Henry, and in 1540 Henry gave it to his 4th wife after he annulled the marriage. This was Anne of Cleves, also known as the Flanders Mare.
Since the Tudor period, Hever passed through the hands of several different families and gradually fell into decline. It may well have fallen into total disrepair had it not been snapped up by the richest man in America, William Waldorf Astor.
Astor threw his immense fortune into refurbishing and reimagining Hever as a grand Tudor fortress, filling it with ornate oak panelling and magnificent Tudor portraits. He created a lavish family home that could indulge his passion for history and impress his VIP guests.
So what we're looking at today is a real hodgepodge of 700 years of tweaks and alterations. Even the moat has caused all sorts of problems in the past. We're on quite low ground here, and as the moat used to join the River Eden, it would spill over the banks and flood the castle's courtyard.
Of course, Astor sorted all of that out in his renovations, and in 1906 he took out the crumbling brick bridge and reinstated this wooden drawbridge, which can still be raised. No doubt useful for any guests who had turned up late.
This gatehouse is home to 2 of the oldest surviving portcullises in England, one of which can still be operated. And here in the castle courtyard, you can clearly see the difference between the 13th century gatehouse and the timber-framed Tudor additions. In Anne Boleyn's day, there would have been 4 doorways on each side rather than the 2 we see today. The east wing was where the servants worked and slept, and the west wing had the private rooms of the Boleyn family. This is the 13th century gatehouse, the oldest part of the castle. This is where William de Hever would have eaten, slept and entertained his guests, and it was pretty luxurious. It even had a guardrobe, aka a loo, which emptied directly down into the moat. Look out below! Sorry.
It's a pretty gruesome collection in here. There are executioner swords, pieces of armour and even instruments of torture. And one of the strangest pieces are these scolds' bridles. These were designed to be worn by outspoken women, a bit like myself, who were suspected to be witches, shrews or scolds. Next we're heading to the inner hall. In the Boleyn's day, this was the kitchen where great feasts were prepared. And Thomas Boleyn even had high ceilings installed to help dissipate the smoke.
Of course, it doesn't look much like a kitchen these days, as much of this panelling and woodwork was installed by William Waldorf Astor, who used this as his grand reception room.
Astor employed 748 men to refurbish the castle, and he was careful to preserve as much of the original structure as possible, with strict instructions to use historically authentic tools, materials and techniques where possible.
But my favourite detail in this room is this portrait of Elizabeth de Valois, who was the third wife of Philip II of Spain. Now, it's a beautiful portrait of Elizabeth, but what's most interesting is this pear-shaped pearl hanging in her hair.
This pearl is La Peregrina. It's believed to be one of the most symmetrical natural pearls ever found. It was also owned by Queen Mary I, and it stayed in the hands of royalty, Hollywood royalty that is, when Richard Burton bought it for Elizabeth Taylor.
And the pearl actually returned to Hever Castle when Elizabeth Taylor wore it whilst filming here at the 1969 film Anne of 1,000 Days. Isn't that neat?
The other bit of bling to look out for in this room is this gilt bronze clock on the mantelpiece. This is a replica of what Henry VIII gave Anne Boleyn on the morning of their marriage in 1532.
I know historians talk all about the significance of this representing the time finally coming or time running out, but for me it's far more simple. Just hours before the wedding, Henry gave Anne a clock. I think he's saying, please don't be late. And who can blame him? Caterers are expensive.
The next stop on our tour is the drawing room. Originally used in Tudor time as domestic offices, this had a new lease of life in 1905. For William Waldorf Astor kitted it out with this extravagant Elizabethan-style panelling, made from oak and holly.
This is the room where Astor would have schmoozed many of his famous friends. We know that Queen Elizabeth II, Winston Churchill and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle were among his guests. You can picture the scene in here. Astor here with all his pals, a few dukes, a few earls, all drinking champagne, gin and tonics perhaps, and all making lots of hearty jokes. A whale of a time, in fact.
They were entertained lavishly, and I'm sure they were impressed by Astor's little surprise behind this door. He transformed the medieval turret into his very own drinks cupboard.
Bottoms up.
After a few bottles of champagne, Astor brought his guests into the dining room. In Tudor times, this was the Great Hall, initially opened right up to the roof rafters. The Boleyns would have dined in this room, and it was here that they entertained Henry VIII and his retinue.
My favourite thing in this room is this impressive gilt lock. This belonged to Henry VIII. The king was so paranoid about assassination, he always travelled with a locksmith, and it was this lock that was fitted to his bedroom wherever he stayed, and then removed when the royal party moved on. Now, if there's one lesson you must take away from a visit to Hever Castle, it's that you must never run up the stairs, for some of these steps, like this one, are different depths.
This wasn't because it was poorly designed or hurriedly built. This was, like in many medieval castles, an ingenious safety feature.
The idea was that if you lived here, you would know which steps were the odd ones, but for invaders, they would be thrown off balance, trip up and give the defenders a crucial advantage.
The next stop on the tour is my favourite room of the whole castle, Anne Boleyn's bedroom.
Anne Boleyn was probably born in 1501 and she spent her childhood here at Hever Castle, and historians think that this was probably her bedroom.
It seems that Anne was fond of Hever. Even when she was a young woman and courting Henry VIII, Anne would often return here. In fact, 7 of the king's love letters were sent to Anne while she was staying at Hever in 1528.
And here she is, wearing her famous bee pendant. She has a daring French-style hood revealing her dark hair. As a young woman, Anne was considered to be intelligent and witty, if not traditionally beautiful. The Venetian ambassador described Anne as not one of the handsomest women in the world. She is of middling stature with a swarthy complexion, long neck, wide mouth, bosom not much raised, and in fact has nothing but the king's great appetite, and her eyes, which are black and beautiful.
Some of Anne's most personal possessions are on display here at Hever Castle. In this room you can see 2 beautifully illuminated prayer books, which were signed and annotated by Anne herself.
These kind of personal prayer books were popular in England from the 13th century until the Reformation. They earned the name the Book of Hours from the short services to the Virgin Mary, which were read at 8 fixed hours during the day, including matins and vespers.
It's incredible to imagine Anne Boleyn walking these corridors. And of course, Henry would have visited on several occasions as they were courting. As Henry would have been given the grandest rooms available, he probably stayed in this room when he came to visit.
So, after being lavishly fed and watered by the Boleyn family with a great feast of pies, game, roasted meats, custards and jellies, King Henry would have probably climbed into this bed and snuggled up to sleep, perhaps dreaming of Anne Boleyn or glory in France, and probably snoring quite a lot, I imagine. Hey, that's private! This bed dates from 1540 and it's a tester bed. The term derives from the Latin word testa, meaning head, because these beds were headed by the solid wooden canopy suspended above it. Cosy. Look, I do love Greensleeves, but can you play Wonderball?
Next up, we're heading to the staircase gallery, built in around 1506 by Thomas Boleyn. The gem in this room is this portrait of Mary Queen of Scots in mourning.
This portrait was recently discovered in France and is believed to have come from the studio of François Clouet, a French Renaissance miniaturist and painter. It's thought that Mary's white mourning gowns were because of the recent death of 3 close family members.
This is probably Hever Castle's most famous room, the Long Gallery. It was built in the 16th century and extends across the entire width of the castle. Here the Boleyns might have entertained guests, displayed art collections and even taken exercise.
The panelling in this room dates from the 16th century, but the meringue-like ceiling was another Astor addition. It was made in London and brought to Hever on a steam train. Astor even had the train tracks extended, just so the ceiling could be installed. The most exciting thing about this room, though, are the 18 original portraits on the wall. These tell the epic saga from the Wars of the Roses all the way through to the Reformation, aka a lot of family drama.
Most of what we see at Hever is really the work of William Waldorf Astor, and he spent a lot of time on re-landscaping the gardens too.
From these dizzying heights, you can see all the re-landscaping that Astor did in the early 1900s. You can see the maze just next to the castle, and beyond that, the Italian garden.
He had 800 men contracted to excavate the 38-acre lake, and they were instructed in December 1904 to carry on the works regularly and continuously by day and night, except on Sundays, when so ordered.
So, there you have it, the magnificent history of Hever Castle in a nutshell. Thanks for watching.
Check out the History Hit YouTube, where you can get great exclusive videos and a sneak peek at what's available on the world's best history channel, History Hit TV. It's growing really fast. We're thrilled to have you all aboard.